In a YouTube conversation on the Unbelievable podcast, an exchange took place between Roger Penrose and William Lane Craig, which was hosted by Justin Brierley in October 2019. They discussed, among other things, Penrose's triadic view of the universe, in which there is the realm of mathematics, the realm of consciousness, and the realm of matter, which exist independently and intersect only to a small degree. Only a small particle of matter is conscious, only a small section of mathematics is inherent in the structure of matter, and only a part of mathematics is discovered by the human mind. Craig, a Protestant philosopher, suggested to Penrose that his view would make even more sense if those three realms were considered as deriving from God. God was immediately defined by everyone in the studio as the divine mind, so Penrose observed that God as some, quote, supermentality, that was Penrose's expression, supermentality, which, again, quoting, can do anything, unquote, would not be the common ground of all reality, but belong to a realm of consciousness, as some kind of conscious being whose existence, unlike the human one, cannot be scientifically proven or studied. That is, of course, an excellent point, and it is what had driven Plotinus to criticize Aristotle's concept of God as nous, or the mind. It wasn't, of course, discussed in the studio by anyone. But after a short while, Penrose added that the hypothesis that God is the cause and source of the three realms is not of much help to him as a scientist. And I quote, "I find it not very explanatory. I don't see how you can do much with this." In June 2024, Michael Levin, who is with us via Zoom, was asked by Kurt Jaimungal on his podcast Theories of Everything whether God, understood somewhat differently as the integrative principle of all reality, has agency. So does God have agency? Interestingly, Levin responded in a quite similar way to Penrose. I quote, I don't know what that really buys us. Unquote. Then Jaimungal postulated to eliminate the word God and reformulated the question, does the world have agency? To this, Levin responded, that is an interesting question. And in his further comments, Mike pointed out that scientists would have to find an empirical way to deal with such questions. Again, a quotation from Michael Levin, we have to do experiments. Experiments on God, one could ask, obviously not. However, these two exchanges, I think, are a very good way to set a problematic context of the dialogue between science and metaphysics in our time and in the future. A scientist wants to, quote, do something with a hypothesis, as Penrose put it, or he needs hypotheses that buy us something, to quote Levin, even before a scientist thinks about testing the hypotheses. And what are we to do with the high-order metaphysical concepts like the divine mind, or the Platonian one, or the maximum of Nicholas of Cusa? In order to proceed and understand the problem fully, we have to remember two fundamental principles of the Platonic metaphysics. Some of you may be familiar with them, but some not, so it's important in any case to emphasize these things. I spelled these principles out in my recent book on Plotinus as the mirroring principle and the participation principle. The mirroring principle means that everything that exists apart from God or the maximum or the one or the first cause, everything that exists except God is a less real image of some more real archetype. The image exists not outside its archetype, but within its archetype. And the participation principle adds to it that the entire reality of the image is in the archetype. Or in other words, the archetype is whatever is real in the image. In this sense, we can say that the image is the archetype by participating in it. And I propose to call it vertical participation, while all the images, several images of a given archetype, they participate not only in the archetype vertically, but also horizontally in each other, because all the images of a single archetype are united with each other because they come from the same source. Nick Cave sings, "I don't believe in an interventionist God, but I know, darling, that you do." And of course, I have never thought I would quote Nick Cave in a paper, but here I am. In fact, all the representatives of what Brian Davies calls classical theism, or what Eric Pearl calls theophanism, and which maybe is better called theophanic theism, from Plotinus through Augustine, Areopagus, to Bonaventure, Aquinas, Cusanus, all of them actually share Nick Cave's doubts about the interventionist God. Let us take a look at the famous analogy of a face reflected in the mirror, which comes from Plotinus and became a medieval commonplace, appearing in such philosophers as Bonaventure of Bagnoregio or Nicholas of Cusa. Bonaventure writes, and this is one of my favorite quotes, as some of you know, "The whole universe is like one mirror filled with lights manifesting the divine wisdom." And Cusanus says that the universe is an innumerable set of mirrors reflecting a single face of the maximum or God. Can we say that anything particular in the reflection of our face in a mirror is based on some kind of intervention on our part, or better, in a zoom transmission like we have here? What exactly about our face displayed on the screen is the intervention of the archetype of that face sitting in front of another computer? Everything and nothing. So it's not very helpful, I think, to imagine that theophanic theism will provide us with the explanation, for instance, of the origin of life or consciousness by bringing in the idea of some kind of intervention of God at a specific moment of time or some place in space. It would not be an evidence for the existence of God. Where could we find the evidence for the existence of, for instance, one of you who are participating via Zoom, in the image of your face that we see on the screen, everywhere and nowhere? Because the archetype exists on a different plane of reality or in a different metaphysical space. To see the real face would mean to turn around and see something existing in an entirely different and incomparably more real way. If we speak about the mirror, if we speak about Zoom, we would have to teleport ourselves to a different place to see the archetype. For now, we see only the image, and everything about the image is an intervention of the archetype and nothing in particular. So only in that case, we realize by comparing the archetype with the image, if we can compare the archetype with the image, then we can see that whatever we see in the mirror, shape, proportions, colors, emotional expression of a face, everything in the mirror is the face, but at the same time, nothing of what we see in the mirror is the real face. Defects and imperfections of the world are not produced by God, just like the key difference between the reflected image in the mirror and the real face. Difference is not caused by the face, but by the mirror, by the deficiency of the mirror. As Blaise Pascal observed, nature has perfections to show us that she is the image of God, and she has defects to show us that she is no more than an image. But what are exactly these defects or limitations that Pascal is talking about? It's within our grasp to try to describe them when we compare a mirror reflection or a zoom transmission to the direct perception of the human body in the same space. So in this analogy, the trick is that there is no real difference of levels, because the reflection in a mirror and the real face, they exist on the same sensible level. So we can compare them with each other. But it is very difficult or even impossible when it comes to the higher metaphysical levels of reality. C.S. Lewis tackled this problem in one of, I think, the best Platonic essays written in the 20th century, namely Transposition. That's the title. It was delivered as a sermon first on Whit Sunday of 1944. It was an interesting case because Lewis allegedly he interrupted his sermon, said, "I'm sorry," and sat down. People sang a hymn, and then he returned and finished his sermon. And then he expanded this. He published this later, and then even later, a year before his death, he expanded the essay in a significant way, adding a very beautiful variant of the Platonic cave allegory in the last version of the essay published in 1962. In this essay, Transposition, Lewis points out that if we know a higher system and a lower system, these are his terms. So if we know a higher system and a lower system on which the higher is transposed, as he puts it, we can very well understand how this mirroring principle or the transposition principle works. And his example is, for instance, if I heard Beethoven's Third Symphony played by an orchestra, I can play the piano reduction, and by the way, it's a beautiful Platonic term in English, a piano reduction of an orchestra piece. I can play the piano reduction of that symphony, and I can imagine and understand how the incredible variety of instrumental colors of orchestra became transposed to the unified sound of piano. But, asks Lewis, what if I have never heard anything but the piano? If we know only the lower system, Lewis argues, we simply cannot imagine or fully understand what is being transposed to the higher system. We can even deny the existence of the higher system or its significance for the understanding of a lower system. And Lewis uses, among other examples, geometry. He was never very good at maths, but he uses geometry, like other Platonists, in his other apologetic works, like The Problem of Pain, Mere Christianity, Miracles. And he says that if we depict realities such as time, for instance, as a straight line, eternity, which is the archetype of time, is not an endless line. It's a plane, or even better, a solid. The participation principle shows us that the line is not only a projection, but also a part contained in the higher system. So a solid would be a higher system, and one of the lines, a lower system. And Lewis calls this participation, he calls it sacramental in his essay. Lewis is alluding, doing that, using this geometry, Lewis is alluding to an 1884 English novel, Flatland, by Edwin Abbott, and claims that the Flatlanders, that this is a fantasy novel, the Flatlanders, people living in two-dimensional world, they couldn't possibly understand or imagine a solid projected on the two-dimensional space. Quite beautifully and compellingly, I think, Lewis suggests that the danger of the Platonic aphoretic method of negation and subtraction in our attempt to understand higher reality lies in the fact that if we strip beings known to us of their qualities, we are left with emptiness, not with something higher, while the archetypal levels are always richer, not poorer than those beings. And in a way, Sean McGrath was talking about this. I can say, well, God is not anything that I can think of, but I'm left with a blank, right? Not with a richer reality when I do it. So when a Flatlander hears that he has to purify his mind in the meditation and realize that a cube is not something spread over a flat space like a square, and the Flatlander knows a square. So the Flatlander is left with a blank, not with the mystical intuition of a cube, which he cannot imagine or understand. And what Lewis says was, it's a part of the tradition, of course. For instance, St. Thomas Aquinas says, intellectus noster, I will translate a minute, intellectus noster incognitionem simplicium pervenire non potest nisi per remotionem compositionis, which means that our intellect, in attempt to understand simple things, cannot do anything but to subtract the complexity. But for Aquinas, this is a problem, because if we say that God is simple, and we imagine that he is simple in a way that an atom is simple, that's a completely wrong way to proceed, because God is richer than all the complexity of the universe. Recently, the same idea has been discussed by Isidoros Katsos, who will be speaking tomorrow, but he couldn't come today. In his forthcoming paper, Is There a Double in Religious Experience? A Pythagorean type response through the lens of Plotinus. In this paper, Isidoros is describing a geometric contraction of, say, a cube to a square, or a projection of a three-dimensional figure on two-dimensional space. And Isidoros is calling this casting a shadow of a three-dimensional object, like a cube, onto two-dimensional space. Would be a square. Square would be a shadow of a cube, or circle would be a shadow of the sphere, and so on. And from the other direction, a cube is an expansion of a square, or a sphere is an expansion of a circle. That's, of course, that's all already in ancient philosophy. We can find that. That is, of course, also the idea behind Nicholas of Cusa's concept of explicatio unfolding and complicatio enfolding. The universe is an unfolding of God, and God is the enfolding of the universe. I think this is of great importance, not only for our theoretical understanding, also for our spiritual practice. And to be more specific, in the Platonic tradition, for instance, the human body is an image of the human soul. You can find it in Plotinus, but also in St. Gregory of Nyssa. In his treatise on the creation of man, says that our bodies are images of our souls, which, if we take it seriously, it means that the body is like a two-dimensional shadow or projection of a richer three-dimensional reality of our soul. Of course, I use dimensions here metaphorically or analogically. But our soul, for these thinkers, would be a three-dimensional projection of a four-dimensional or infinite dimensional God in turn, because the soul is the image of God and the body is the image of the soul. So the soul is not a ghost, a faint Homeric creature deprived of sensible qualities and, like in Homer's Odyssey, craving for blood to flesh itself out. It is the body that is a ghost in comparison with the soul. It is the body that is deprived of the reality and richness that the soul has. But the soul must contain everything that the body manifests. The soul lacks nothing in relationship to the body. So it would be absurd to imagine in a flatland that cubes are these invisible things living inside squares. And if a square dies, this thing survives after death. The destruction of the two-dimensional square leaves the three-dimensional cube free to fly to another image. But if this is so absurd, why are we keep doing this in our discourse about the soul and its so-called afterlife, imagining our soul as a ghost in a machine which changes bodies like we change hotels when we travel? When we look at each other right now, we see weaker projections of our souls that present themselves to our senses. As Leibniz argued in his image of the incorporeal monads appearing to each other as bodies. Ultimately, when we look into our soul, we see a weaker projection of God, or the God-man, the Logos incarnate in the Christian tradition. When we look at our bodies, we see the souls of others and we don't see them at the same time. When we look at our souls, we see God and we don't see him at the same time. Let us now return to the question of a possible dialogue between science and metaphysics, or biology and metaphysics. Could it be based, as this conference suggests, on the theory of the logoi or rationes, or these intelligible principles that the Platonic metaphysics talks about? Or maybe we can find other more specific and partial metaphysical concepts if God is not very explanatory, as Penrose put it. We don't know what to do with God when we do science. So when it comes to living beings, as we heard before, these intelligible, invisible principles, maybe called logoi or forms in the Aristotelian sense, or souls even, plant souls, animal souls, human souls. But the term soul seems too charged with unnecessary associations to be useful for a scientist, I think, unfortunately. But the main point of the theory is that the invisible structure of the world consists of intelligible and intelligent principles, which are both formal causes and final causes or purposes, goals of existing organisms, all beings, in fact, not only living organisms. So if we identify these intelligible principles or logoi with dynamical systems, or autopoietic systems, it could lead to interesting places, I think. But the question still remains the one asked by Penrose. Is it very explanatory? Or can we do anything with it? Does it bias anything? So philosophers should humbly let the scientists decide, I think. But the somewhat pessimistic aspect of my argument is linked to the skepticism of many scientists, including such open minds like Penrose and Levin, with the skepticism with regard to the possibility that the high-order metaphysical concepts can really be useful to scientists in their empirical work. I would add to this pessimism also our metaphysical understanding of what Lewis called transposition, or what I call the mirroring principle. So what a biologist can study in a living organism is much like a square, which is a shadow of a cube, where the square is the entire living organism, or even one cell, while the cube is the invisible logos, the ratio, the soul, the intelligible principle of the organism. The problem is also that the geometer can imagine both squares and cubes, while both biologists and metaphysicians and theologians, even mystics, cannot fully grasp the logoi or souls, which both reveal themselves in and hide behind the organisms that we can empirically study. Can we, Flatlanders, say, we're only studying squares, let's not bother with cubes, because they cannot be empirically tested? Only the adherents of that weird sect which believes in the other world of 3 dimensions, they believe in the existence of cubes, but we cannot test this hypothesis. On the other hand, how our vague premonitions and inconclusive debatable formulations of our flatlandish intuitions of cubes can contribute to what we know about squares. Well, Avicenna argued that a given science cannot demonstrate its own object, and Aquinas agreed with him, and the whole tradition, I think, agrees with it. But Jacques Maritain spoke about the poverty of metaphysics, because metaphysics is so general and considers being as such, it has little to contribute. That was Maritain's point. It has little to say about particular beings or even kinds of beings, like biological species. However, even from that point of view, what the Platonic metaphysics can do, I think, is to provide an inspiration and a warning, which is perhaps too little for some, but maybe it's enough for others. Dennis Noble writes in his 2006 book, The Music of Life, that we need to abandon the reductionist approach to biology, and I quote Noble, we should develop ways of thinking about integration that are as rigorous as our reductionist procedures, but different. This is a major change. This is still Noble. It has implications beyond the purely scientific. It means changing our philosophy in the full sense of the term, end of quote. We can also see that Michael Levin is using metaphysical concepts in very interesting ways in his work, both taken from the philosophical tradition of the West and of the East to conceptualize some aspects of his empirical research. In cognitive science, our friend John Vervaeke is also using Neoplatonism to study human cognition. So some of the scientists are working on, some scientists who are working on squares are very interested in cubes, to stick to that already worn out metaphor that I'm using. So, but because a great lie of the last 2 or 3 centuries was that a so-called scientific worldview, which Lloyd Gerson defines as naturalism, so based on 5 tenets: nominalism, materialism, mechanism, skepticism, and relativism. So naturalism emerged by way of logical inference out of hard scientific discoveries, we are told. But naturalism, thus conceived, can be traced back to the ancient Greek philosophy of the 5th century, where there was no science as we know it. So that this whole ontological framework of modernity, which we are so familiar with, and which is parasitic on natural sciences, it's a philosophical position, which rhetorically uses scientific knowledge to justify its claims, which cannot be scientifically verified or falsified. So I have like 5 or 6 more minutes, I think. So
we started a little late, so
yeah,
5, 6 minutes.
Okay, so this naturalistic, scientistic worldview is then contrasted with a very fideistic versions of Christianity, which is sometimes even hostile to reason, and it's a serious problem because the war between scientism and religion is really a proxy war between naturalism and Platonism as two philosophical visions of reality. And some time ago, Stephen Hawking announced in 2011 that philosophy is dead because it couldn't keep up with physics. The exact epitaph for the death of philosophy was the headline of the Telegraph article. And the title was Stephen Hawking tells Google philosophy is dead. Mm-hmm. The physical universe may or may have not begun with a big bang, but philosophy apparently doesn't end with a bang, but with a mention of Google. Mm-hmm. So now Dennis Noble says we have to change our philosophy if we want better science. And here I see a possibility of interaction with the Platonic tradition. Maybe you heard about this book by Thomas Nagel, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. It was published a year after the demise of philosophy announced by Hawking. But so Nagel says, now we realize that this view, this reductionist view, doesn't hold. But for centuries, different philosophers were saying that. It's not to criticize Nagel too aggressively, but really the idea that now we discovered, we had this revelation that we have to return to some kind of metaphysics if we want to proceed with scientific endeavor. This is a very strange idea because we have centuries of this tradition criticizing naturalistic and reductionistic positions. So what I mean by inspiration and warning to come to a close of this paper. So the warning would be that we know from metaphysical perspective that the world is beautiful, intelligible, ordered, true, and good. And these are not just our subjective emotional responses of our brains, it is reality. And I think many scientists feel that intuitively without being interested in metaphysics or without need to study it. But a warning would be like a constraint for scientists. Okay, so we're free to inquire, but if we accept this intuition that the world is intelligible or that it's not absolutely mechanical or absolutely deterministic or absolutely random, it can help, I think, maybe scientists to in their practice of science. So a warning would be like a constraint. And when Einstein was rejecting the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, because if it's true, it means that the world is unintelligible. I think Einstein was operating within some constraint. We know Einstein apparently he believed in the God of Spinoza, and maybe this was the reason that he rejected this interpretation of quantum mechanics. And Penrose also thinks that quantum mechanics cannot hold ultimately. So and an inspiration would be something similar, but also a bit different. So Gerard Manley Hopkins, a great 19th century poet, pointed out in his notebooks, science is atomic, not to be grasped and held together, scopeless without metaphysics. This alone gives meaning, this metaphysics alone gives meaning to laws and sequences and causes and developments, end of quote. But would contemporary scientists listen to a poet? Perhaps. What gives me hope is that, and I return at the end to this interview, this conversation of Michael Levin with Kurt Jaimangal, which I think is very interesting, 2 parts of it, at least. So Michael Levin raises a question in the conversation: how do we know if we are not a part of a bigger mind, parts of bigger whole? And Michael describes two neurons in a human brain having a conversation. One neuron says that all that exists are just molecules, electric signals, chemical compounds, and there is no mind in reality. And the second one says, no, we are just part of this bigger system of or consciousness or mind. And the first neuron mocks him and says, well, it's a wishful thinking, imagining faces in the clouds. But Levin points out that the second neuron is actually right. And it makes huge difference whether the neuron believes that he's a part of a bigger whole or not. So I think the inspiration provided by metaphysics could be potentially fruitful for scientists. But again, it's the scientists that have to decide whether it's useful for them or not. So I will end, again, somewhat pessimistically with Plato's Phaedo, where Socrates says, ironically, that about the naturalistic, reductionistic explanations of his time. He says, Socrates in Plato says, I no longer believe that I know by this method, this reductionist method, even how one is generated, or in a word, how anything is generated, or is destroyed, or exists. I no longer admit this method. I have another confused way of my own, which would be Platonic metaphysics. So we are living at a time of uncertainty and confusion. I think Plato tells us that we should embrace this uncertainty and this confusion in order to make space for something else, for more fruitful dialogue between metaphysics and natural sciences. I will end with that.
Thank you, Mateusz. I'm sure that lots of discussion can be generated from this paper. Andrew Johnson.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am inclined to think, I agree with you entirely, but I would rather express it as two extreme dangers. One danger is the work of science-engaged theology in the 1950s by people like Polkinghorne and Barber, who were trying to find an interaction between God and the world at the quantum level, at the chaos level, top-down causation level, all premised on the idea that the two were in competition in some way. And we've come a long way since then, thankfully. And so there are ideas like theistic naturalism, where God and the world are not in competition, by a double agency, Thomistic double agency, or even Maximian logoi. The other danger is kind of, it's sort of like, you can't say anything about, it's like non-overlapping magisteria, like Stephen Jay Gould would say. So is there an intermediate somewhere, for example, I often ask the question to people at Faraday, can metaphysics and theology help you do better experimental design to, say, distinguish between mother's milk and formula milk? Okay. I'm inclined to think the answer is no, but can metaphysics and theology help you become more inspired as to what to experiment on and to think of new ways of solving problems? Akin to theoria physicae of the early church, contemplating the natural world and then coming out with it. I think that's a possible middle ground. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I honestly, I don't know, because it seems for me arrogant, for me as someone who works on metaphysics and philosophy and all things like that, to say that I know what scientists should do or how scientists should do science better. Just in the same way, I think it's arrogant on the part of scientists to say, well, we don't need that. We don't need that. We can completely dispose of that and do excellent science. So the middle ground is, as you say, this is exactly what we need. This is the fascinating space, and it can arise only in dialogue, I think. So we should have more dialogue, and we are already having some dialogue. We should have more dialogue, and maybe in the future we will have metaphysicians in a lab discussing things with scientists, and scientists participating in theological seminaries. It's already happening one way around, not the other way around. So I don't know. And also that there is this romantic fantasy of someone who would be a scientist, a philosopher, a prophet, a mystic, a poet. So can we have someone who could have all of this in his mind equally, not a Renaissance man because Renaissance is in the past, but a new kind of synthetic figure who could do some super stuff in science. Although that would be a fantasy, but maybe.
To quickly add on to this, to abuse my moderatorial privilege, we had someone, a visitor at my institute in Zagreb a couple of weeks ago named Tim Maudlin, philosopher of science, and we had more or less this debate about these two kind of extremes with nothing in between, evoking Mateusz's answer, where Maudlin was asked, well, should a scientist bring his religious convictions into the lab, or do you check it completely at the door? And Maudlin's answer was, well, you know, truth is empirical, everything is found through experiments. Propose God if you like, you'll find out it's wrong every time. But there was no space for the Mickiewicz-like prophet poet in the middle.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. One is Milton's wonderful reference to Galileo in Paradise Lost as the Tuscan artist. So there's a broader conception of the artist than the one that we use. But isn't it the fact that you mentioned Einstein, and I understand that in a way the contrast between Einstein and Heisenberg could be presented as the conflict between a Spinozist and a Leibnizian. So here you've got a sort of Stoic pantheistic model in Einstein and something more Platonic in Heisenberg. And I think both are quite explicit about their philosophical sources. I mean, are we being a bit unfair when we're appealing simply to the banazoi, who are rejecting any philosophy or theology, when some of the greatest practitioners of science have been quite explicit about some of the background hypotheses derived from philosophy and theology that have influenced them in their very high-level scientific work?
Yeah. Yes, well, there was a time, I cannot say exactly, maybe Andrew will know, there was a time when many people would say, okay, physicists are open to mysticism and religion, but biologists are hardcore atheists. From what I see right now is that it has changed. The biologists seem interested in all these things, and teleology is making a return. It was exorcised from when I was a student of philosophy. There was no question about teleology coming back. But I think now it's different.
To some extent, especially because of the extension of fine-tuning from the world of physics into biology, constraints on protein folding, convergent evolution, all of these phenomena.
And I'm also a psychologist, so now I would say the psychologists now are the atheists, if not biologists and physicists. So maybe in the future, psychologists will, well, John Vervaeke is an exception, of course, but psychology is very sort of fragmented, reductionistic. It lacks this coherent vision and dialogue with metaphysics. So it's an interesting movement, that sort of expansion of the old ways of thinking into new areas of natural and experimental.
And it's the case that sometimes the hard-nosed scientists, like Sir Richard Dawkins, veer into highly speculative realms under the guise of being very scientific, when, for example, the notion of memes. I mean, obviously, what's driving that is some naturalistic account of the bizarre realm of culture and reasons. And he's trying to give a model that will somehow mirror the scientific, even though it ends up being a pretty...
Although it's run away with itself.
Yeah.
It's appropriated.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Many thanks, Mateusz, for the fascinating talk. I have a question an historical question. In your perspective, since at some point you mentioned about the last 2 or 3 centuries, and the kind of change of the relationship between science and metaphysics and religion. And in my mind, since we are in Cambridge, of course, if we think about the Cambridge of the last part of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th, of course, Newton and in the second edition of the Principia Mathematica, he adds the Scholium Generale, in which he speaks about God. He's in a sense and also he has the idea that doing natural science is in some way trying to do through mathematics what getting closer to what Moses already told in the Gen. So a very different perspective, and also a perspective in which you have a great emphasis on theophany. Like the idea that God is, the world is the body of God. And so in a figure like Newton, you still have this kind of a person, what you were saying before, someone who is a philosopher, but also, one studies the Bible, or studies, so maybe something just after this moment changed.
Yes, well, it's difficult to hit that exactly the moment. It's a process, but yes, it used to be a myth that modernity and the scientific revolution is the fight of rational people against crazy inquisitors, just running after Galileo to put him into a house arrest. We know that Galileo was celebrated in Rome. All the cardinals were looking through the telescope to see. So he was a friend of Pope, and whom he criticized in one of his dialogues, which was probably the problem of the whole issue. And so the great myth was that modernity is completely secular, but now we know that it's not the case. And Francis Yates was writing about the esoteric sources of modernity, scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment. And now I think most of the historians would say that obviously the modern science was inspired by alchemy and astrology and the Kabbalah. And although when Newton died, his I forgot his name. The person who was responsible for publishing his materials, when he saw all the alchemical stuff, he said not publishable. And only in the 20th century people started to study this, and now we know that behind Newton's thinking there was things which at our time would be called occultism, esotericism, and things like that. So we know that the context for the scientific revolution was not only religious, but also probably magical and astrological and all of that. So it was, to a certain extent, it was a myth of the maybe late 18th and 19th century. And now we have to retell the history. But so I think the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, this is the period where this very reductionistic, naturalistic worldview is dominant. But it's not the entire truth, because you find romantic reaction, you find idealism of the 19th century, British idealism of the late 19th and early 20th century. So it was never a complete triumph. But still, I think the students of philosophy and other subjects, they hear that kind of story, the dark Middle Ages, the light of the Renaissance, burning the witches, things like that. Okay, the light of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the church trying to stop that. This is complete rubbish, but still this is being taught, at least in some faculties. That's why we have to repeat all of that. Thank you.